about, or do you guys think that that's a good start?
I think that's a good starting place.
Agreed.
Yeah. Oh, the issue I have with Batson is that I don't think that Batson really changed anything. So, like, I don't think, like, yeah, it's like a false security blanket, like false security that, like, oh, we're changing something, but I think in the end people just get around it and nothing really happened. So I don't think anything's been done. Anything's really been done. So, I mean, people have tried to do things, but I don't think anything's been done yet.
Well, I agree that it doesn't necessarily have the practical changes. I think by making the ruling in Batson, one thing that the Supreme Court did do is issue a statement of intent, in that they're saying that they don't like racism when it comes to jury selection, and while that is often circumvented by excuses that are supposedly neutral, it's still the Supreme Court saying that if they're that they don't want racism to be a factor in jury selection, and possibly even that if there were a case in which the Supreme Court could actually do something, they would be willing to take it.
Yeah, I agree that the outcome of Batson was really the intent and saying we actually care about this issue. So yeah, I agree with that.
I think what you said about excuses is really interesting, because I think, like, when we were looking at McCluskey v. Kemp, something that came up is that, like, when it's brought up about it being racially motivated, the decision, they can just say, like, no, it's the crime that caused this. So I think that, like, you try to come up with a solution so that it's not racially motivated, but then you can just keep coming up with these other excuses, like, no, this was the crime, or it was that. So it's hard to move forward when there's so many ways to get around the race problem.
Yeah, something that Brian Stevenson said in the video is that the study proved, I forget what the study was called, it proved that race was the greatest, like, indicator of whether or not someone was going to get the death penalty for a crime they committed. And the fact that the Supreme Court acknowledged that and basically said they couldn't do anything about it seems like, to me, in and of itself, a violation of the 14th Amendment. And like then, like what you said, like, at least in Batson they had a statement of intent, even if it actually didn't make as much of a difference. So yeah, that's what's so troubling to me about the McCluskey ruling.
If they outlawed the death penalty, I get that would stop the death penalty from necessarily having a racist intent, but I think you can extrapolate, like, they didn't do this study necessarily, but I think it's a pretty obvious extrapolation to make that if the death penalty is gonna be based on race, then other punishments must be based on race as well. And so it's not like getting rid of the death penalty necessarily gives black people or minorities equity in the justice system. And I don't think the solution is to outlaw any penalty. I don't know what the solution is, but I don't know. But I think the court might have a point in saying that what they're being asked to do is not necessarily the solution.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point. I also think that you can't just say that because it could or might not help everything, like, you shouldn't try to tackle one problem. I think that while race is an issue in many forms of punishment, it's not bad to start somewhere. And I think that this is a super concrete one because it's life or death. It's not more jail time or less jail time. So I think that this is a good place to start.
I think the problem here is that you could make the conclusion that if death penalty can be outlawed for having racial bias, then all other crimes could be, because there's an inevitable racial bias in the criminal justice system. So I think that was part of the Supreme Court's problem here.
And also just that getting rid of something is not necessarily the solution to make it better. Like, I think the death penalty has its own problems in an inherent way, but it's not that the death penalty inherently leads to racist decisions. There just was racist decisions about the death penalty, but those decisions could be about any other situation which an African American is going through the justice system.
I was gonna go back to Jess's point, about how, I think that the least, like, the Supreme Court didn't even try to, like, get to do anything, like, Batson, like you said, they tried to do something, like, I mean, it didn't really work so well, but at least they showed they were trying. Like, the least they could have done with McCleskey is been like, okay, we're gonna attempt to do something, even though this is a problem that maybe we can't solve, because it's like almost impossible to solve it, but at least we're showing that we're trying to do something. Instead, they just were like, nope, it's impossible to solve it, we're not even gonna try. So I think that, so I agree with that.
But isn't kind of what they're doing, like, if Plessy v. Ferguson, like, if they were to say, like, oh, we can't make these train cars equal, so we're just gonna get rid of train cars. Like, isn't that kind of the same logic? Like, if you can't make something equal, I guess maybe you should get rid of it, but
But I don't think it's about making it equal. I think it has more to do with, like, is there a problem in what they're doing? Like,
Right.
is there a problem with the death penalty? Like, the equal part is just kind of on top of that, it feels like to me.
Yeah, but how do you fix that? Like, then do you look at, like, everybody who's on death row and you're like, okay, like, we'll get all these, like, white people in to, like, get the death, like, I don't know, it's so hard, like, trying to think of a solution. Yeah, like, if we're not going right to getting rid of it, like, if they're trying to make, instead of just outlawing it completely, making, like, adaptions to it.
I think that's the difference, I think, between train cars and this, is that you can change train cars. You can make a law that makes them equal, you can't really change people's minds.
The DOS,
Yeah, I have a question for David. Do you think the solution is to get rid of the death penalty completely, or are you not?
no, I think that's not the solution. Well, I think that might be that does solve the problem of more black people getting the death penalty, but it doesn't solve the problem of having a institution that, I guess through the study, I think it needs to be studied more, like where exactly are African Americans at a disadvantage in the court system, like why those results come up, like is it purely just racist, right, purely just the judge being racist, or are there other factors? And I think, the thing is, I don't agree with the death penalty inherently, so I think it should be gone, but I don't think getting rid of it helps black people receive equal protection from law.
It only solves the current problem, though.
What?
The problem of killing more black people, if you get rid of that penalty, you can't kill more black people.
But you can put more of them in jail for life.
Yes, that's
and
a
is
separate
that-
issue, though.
And is
Yeah,
that, but
I
it's
agree.
kind of the same issue, right?
But at
Like,
least you're not killing them.
Like, it's not
Yeah.
life and death, but it's just gonna be the same white people are always gonna be an advantage.
Yes.
in
Right,
the
or-
justice
yeah.
system.
I think the
I
question.
mean, I get, yeah,
Well,
right,
right,
that
so
you-
why don't you take one step at a time, like you can't necessarily, like, take all the issues at once.
But what do you mean by one step? If getting rid of the death penalty is one step,
That's
then,
one step.
then what's the next step? Is it getting rid of life imprisonment? If you're just getting rid of punishments,
Yeah.
those aren't steps, those are just,
Like,
Well,
Yeah.
there are steps, but
But-
towards what we've been talking about
Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
inevitable defanging of criminal justice
Right.
entirely.
Yeah.
right. So, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but we're basically talking about, like, you can't really get rid of the criminal justice system, but also trying to get, decide what to do with this, like, racist, the unequal, the unequal distribution of the, I can't speak right now, but how everything's being unequally distributed, but you can't just take it away, otherwise you have no criminal justice system.
Which is the very argument that is going on between the Batson ruling and the McCleskey ruling, right?
Right.
That's the problem that we're trying to solve.
We talked a lot about, like, putting standards in place for, like, what cases should get the death penalty. Do you think that, like, having concrete standards could help the racial problem?
Yeah, I was just saying that like, I don't have a lot to go on this, but I think it definitely would. I think setting up some sort of standards, like, I mean, I think the issue is that there's gonna be a lot of like inherent racism, and we know that for a fact, but I think if there were some guidelines, it could help I don't think it would like wipe out the problem completely, but I think it could definitely help.
I mean, the problem is that like under most standards of the death penalty, like McCluskey kind of deserves the death penalty. Like under what most states would say, like if you're gonna have like a minimum crime to do the death penalty, I feel like most states that are pro death penalty would put what he did and was proven to do under like not like it's kind of not contested whether or not he was guilty or not. I feel like Georgia would probably put that in their standards of having a death penalty. So if you're trying to establish standards, you can't really do it in this case.
Well, another thing about the standards is that when you have standards on these things, there are two options. One is that you make them like actual concrete standards, which are binding to the jury, in which case the jury has no actual role. Or you have standards that are more just guidelines, and then the juries can just say, yeah, but we don't care, this is death penalty anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't really think that in either case, the standards are a good idea.
So do you think the solution is to have like no standards at all, or do you think that one is better than the other?
I think that when people hear death penalty, they already know that it should be reserved for the most heinous crimes in their opinions, and wow, what exactly is a most heinous crime is subjective. I think that goes to further the point as to why there shouldn't really be standards.
There shouldn't be standards.
Should not.
So I read an article about the study, because I was trying to find places that actually went against what the study said, and I found one article that basically said a predictor that is actually, it had a lot of different problems with the study, but one thing I remember specifically was it said that a predictor for the death penalty was often is this crime done against a stranger, or is it done against somebody they knew? Whereas if it was done against a stranger, it invoked more fear in the public because they felt like anyone could be next. And for some reason, I don't know why, African Americans in that state were more likely to commit heinous crimes against a stranger than white people. So I feel like it's still based on fear, like, and maybe that is why the death penalty is wrong, because people are still going off of what they fear. Like they want somebody dead because they're scared of them. And I think I don't necessarily know what that means, but I don't think it necessarily disproves that it's still racially motivated.
So do you think there should or shouldn't be standards?
Standard, I think you should have general standards for every crime, like what they should do, but also I think juries should be able to decide. But I think that's why the death penalty is problematic in general, is just because I think there's an argument to be made that the death penalty is almost like is like a punishment, a more emotional punishment, and therefore it might be more prone to factors that aren't whether or not the crime was worse.
Right, because doesn't the difference between death penalty and life in prison without parole seem kind of arbitrary about who gets what punishment?
Yeah.
Right? Which is that if the single greatest indicator, or the two biggest indicators, like David said, of whether or not someone gets the death penalty or life without parole are race and whether or not the victim was a stranger, that feels kind of arbitrary, at least by criminal justice standards. So my solution to this McCluskey problem would be to eliminate the death penalty, because at least, obviously that's not going to solve racism in the criminal justice system, but at least it's going to eliminate that little bit of arbitrariness between life without parole and the death penalty.
and you'd be justified in making that decision because of like gig low and things like that.
2 minutes,
Because
guys, 2
unequal
minutes.
enforcement constitutes unequal protection.
Right. I mean, the question is this, I think what we didn't answer is like, is this case not equal protection?
Yeah.
Like, does it prove unequal protection, that study? Because it doesn't prove it in that case, it proves it over many cases, and I don't know if that's valid or not.
It's really difficult to look at one case and get unequal protection out of it unless it's real clear.
Right.
So it could have been unequal protection, the problem is that we don't actually have any facts telling us that it was. We have facts telling us that generally there is a trend of unequal protection.
But not in this specific
But we don't
situation,
know
right?
how
That's
it's
the problem.
It's a bit like to a case, like I don't know what like the judge was looking for as a solution.
Well, I think what might have helped is that they used a case where the guy's crime wasn't that wasn't
Wasn't worthy of death
wasn't
penalty.
it wasn't like it's like, especially at that time, like most people in Georgia would say that crime, that guy should get the death penalty. So I think if they picked a crime where it wasn't necessarily clear cut, I think that would have a lot more of an impact.
Like they did in Miranda, that was a similar technique,
I
right?
like where the crimes would like overshadow like the underlying problem.
Right.
Any final thoughts?
Thank you guys, terrific. All right, switch it up. So for those of you who are taking notes, if you have any final notes to take on that, just jot them down. You are going to now become the seminar participants. And those who were in that seminar, your job now is to watch those who are in it.
So should I just do one self-assessment?
Yeah.
Yeah, same for me. I'm
Who's your partner?
Chava.
I would have could have had you guys do it for each other, but oh well. I didn't know that. Oh well. I'm really curious, guys, to talk to you because I know. Guys, can you resettle? Guys, can you resettle quietly? Because I just want to pose a question to you to be thinking about. We can process this tomorrow when we meet. Because I know that seminars have not been the most popular learning tool that we have used, and a lot of people have felt like they're not either helpful or interesting, and I still believe that there's value in doing them, and so I'm wondering if today, if having these learning goals or rubrics helped with the seminar in general, or helps with the upcoming seminar in general, or if not, I would give some space to just talk about seminars generally moving forward. And I appreciate, by the way, you guys, your willingness to keep trying new things with it. That's really, I really do appreciate that.
Sorry, could I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
How many people are normally in this class? Like, full?
Year to year?
No, like this year.
Which is that one,
20.
No, so we have 20 people in our class?
Yeah.
Okay, how many people are here now?
That's 4 we're missing.
We're missing 4, okay. Because I thought size might be a significant factor.
It may. I think there are a lot of predictors, but we know that race is the most important. I can't believe I'm saying this with the tape running. What's the matter with me? All right. Do you?
Yeah, you both been recording, so.
Does the internal? As the other group actually surfaced several really interesting questions. You can pick up on any of them. You can pick up on any of the questions from the previous seminar. If you guys have a question that you guys are interested in, or if you want to turn, I have a question for me surfaced in my mind out of that. If you want to hear that, I'm happy to share that as well. But other than that, I want you guys to be independent in your seminar. So I will sit down and shut up. Yes, you have a question?
Yes, it's one last clarifying question about the rubric.
Yeah.
So Sarah just now filled out mine, and
Right.
do I fill out the same one that Sarah
You.
wrote for me?
No,
No, you.
write one for her.
Hold on, wait a minute.
No, I
For
wrote one
homework,
her,
you're
but,
doing one for yourself.
but it's not the one that Sarah made for me.
Right.
This is a
You're
different
doing,
one.
no, you're doing one that I wrote for you.
So yeah,
That
so
you wrote
she,
for me.
right, so Sarah wrote out a goal, Sarah wrote out a goal, this is my goal for the seminar, and then
Yeah.
you created a rubric out of that.
Yes.
You are now gonna fill out that rubric, the one that you created for her,
But is my self-assessment
is gonna be the one that
same
she
way?
built for you,
Okay.
yes.
Not built, not, it's the one you built for yourself.
Yeah.
What what you did, you
Both
wrote,
people contribute something to both
yeah,
of
you
them.
wrote out your goals, and then the other person took those goals and built a rubric out of it.
Which is basically saying, alright, I'm gonna assign a point value to the things that you said, so it's basically you built the rubric,
Okay,
really.
so I
Fair enough.
said my two goals here.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, you can explain it over homework.
Alright.
I'm always happy to argue.
And I love that about you. So many things I love about you. Okay, so now, are you guys ready to begin?
So ready.
Then go.
Do we wanna continue with the last seminar or like start new?
So my biggest question is probably, I don't know if it's part of the seminar, but like, why racism has to be the only thing, like, why abolishing the death penalty is the only way to get rid of the racism, like that's, if there is racism that's inciting death penalty, like, weren't there other predictors, couldn't you have chosen a better jury or something?
Well, I was just gonna phrase that as a question, which is just what other solutions are there to this issue of obvious racism in the judicial system?
Well, it seems like, according to the study at least, there weren't really other factors to fix or control for. They said
They said it was the biggest factor.
overall, the biggest, and like most determining factor controlling for all sorts of different things is race,
But there still are other controlling factors, right?
such as,
Let's say jury selection, where there's an all-white jury versus an all-black jury, or maybe.
that's race.
No,
Yeah, but it's
he's not saying if race was the issue, it's things to prevent race from being the ultimate factor in death. That's not the right way to phrase it. Oh, that's okay.
Other factors might be like location, like what the actual crime was. Like those are things that are factors, I think.
Yeah.
But how do you think, like,
Well, my personal, like, what I was thinking is that you just have a different, you know, make it so that certain juries are picked based on the crime, and figure out what will most minimize the race bias in deciding the death penalty by like just trying a bunch of different things with jury arrangement, and then once you find something that works, then you can implement that.
That sounds really
Not just trying, no, if I'm not guessing check, jury implementation, like what factors lead to a less bias.
could you give an example?
Yeah, so like, let's say there's a all white jury versus an all black and an all white jury, versus the defendant who's black and is being tried for the death penalty. In the all white jury, it's more likely that'll be racism, whereas in the all white / all black jury, there's less likely, right? So that's one factor.
But how do you define racism as a conviction? Do you define racism as a, how do you
I don't understand your question.
You said that it's more likely to be racist in a white jury, all white jury, but how do you, hypothetically, but I'm saying like, how could you tell what is racism by looking at?
It's a statistics question.
You can't always tell what's racism because, like, most people won't admit that they're racist, and it might not even be a conscious thing. It might just be like a subconscious thought of fear, which is sort of what the other group talked about. So I feel like that's something that'd be hard for you to measure.
So what do you think, Adam?
I think that we should get rid of the death penalty because I don't think there is really a possible way that you can make it not equal. And then I also think that the difference in logic between the death penalty and other crimes where death wouldn't be the sentence is that if you find later that race was like one major factor or the major factor in a case in which someone was not given death, then you can go back and you can change that, except you don't have the opportunity for that if someone dies.
Is that a constitutional distinction though?
Like,
I don't think, and I feel like the Constitution sort of sees the death penalty as like just another variety of
I know, except, and, yeah, like, I
But
would,
it doesn't consider what the reversibility of different types of punishments as ways to, guarantee them as, like, maybe, I could see that maybe as a way of describing it as like cruel and unusual because it's irreversible, but that, I feel like
I
that's
don't
not.
think it's cruel and unusual, it's just that if you have a problem that you can't fix, like the problem is that it's unequally applied with black people, and I personally don't think there's a way that you can fix that, except
Like why?
why, well, because I don't think that people will ever not have a racial bias. I think that's an unrealistic, unattainable goal.
Also, like, okay.
Yeah.
Also, like, we saw how people, even if you, like, set up laws, how people so easily can, like, get around things, and, like, it's, like, even if they're, like, they don't come out and say race, like, we know that, like, people are gonna continue to be racist.
I have a question. I'm interested in the question that the group before us talked about. Do standards help anything or not? I want to hear what other people think about that.
Well, what would the goal of the standards be? Like, who would be enforcing these standards?
So the standards are part of the mechanisms of death sentencing in each state. So this comes from after Gregg v. Georgia, or it comes from after Furman v. Georgia, and then the state said in Gregg v. Georgia that we have now standardized it by saying if you have one of these aggravating factors, like it was a police officer that you killed, or it's a second attempt, or something like that. If you add one of those standards to say only in these cases is the death penalty even on the table, do we think that that can help mitigate racism or not?
But like when I'm saying what's enforcing it, it's like like they're gonna have one vote in the end, either yes or guilty or not guilty in the sentence. But like who determines, like, do they look at the reasoning behind it? Do they have to have reasoning? Like why couldn't the people lie when they do standards?
His question was just focusing on, at least as far as I can understand, the idea of whether setting standards for the jury under what circumstances they are allowed to give the death penalty is constitutionally okay, and from our perspective, whether we think it's just okay in general.
Oh, well I
Yeah, I have a clarifying.
Sure.
So are you asking if it's constitutionally okay to have standards, or if it would help
Well,
to have standards to?
I think I'm asking, does it actually help? Because the court already said that it was constitutional to have standards, and that actually you need to have standards. What do you think? What do I think? Alright, so I'm a little bit torn on this, because the court rules that you must have standards, and once someone passes those standards, they are then eligible for the death penalty. But then once you get to that point, it goes to the jury to decide what is the punishment that's given, and the jury decides whether they pass the standards. I think that in general, standards are a much better thing for our society, that it can remove arbitrariness. But I'm wondering if it doesn't actually do anything if deciding on the standard is still in the hands of the jury.
And also if deciding whether or not to follow the standards is
You
a
can't
decision.
decide whether or not to follow the standard.
Yeah, they were saying that it's not that they were saying in the DAFA that,
That comes before Gregg v. Georgia.
so Gregg v. Georgia overruled McGaugha?
No.
No.
I think it's just a different.
Gregg v. Georgia is a different case from McGaugha.
A lot of people think Furman overturned McGaugha.
Didn't they say that jury nullification was a common practice, ignoring the law in order to
This
exercise?
is not jury
That's
nullification.
Wasn't it jury nullification of the standards? If the jury
No,
had a standards.
it's you
that-
decide that the person didn't qualify for the standards, that they didn't do. You could say that a jury, for whatever reason, could say that white people never passed the standard, so would never be eligible for the death penalty. And they could say that a black person, is always passing the standard and could always be eligible for the death penalty. That would be the get around I think on its face, it's much less racist. Don't know about the application of it.
Aren't many of them, aren't many of the standards so like specific as in like, if like you killed a police officer, like then you get the death penalty, cause then I think it is jury nullification, is that the word? Jury nullification.
Well,
Yeah.
jury
Because-
nullification's a specific term about like ignoring what the rules are.
Well, so then you could get around, like say a white man did kill a police officer, then the juries were saying like ignoring the evidence that proved it, or like, and then that was jury nullification.
That would be it.
So I have the standards open now, and it seems like the way that they function is that it's not that a person has to get a death penalty if they do a certain thing. It's that if they do a certain thing, the death penalty is a possibility. So you still leave the jury with a certain amount of choice, where they can choose based on some arbitrary factor whether or not the person deserves the death penalty.
I think if there's once there's room for the jury to choose whether or not to impose the death penalty, even after they pass a certain bar of, what do we say, of standards, like even if there's some standards, once you reach the point of the jury making up their mind yes or no, I don't think that it's possible to.
But a sentencing scheme like that would violate the Fifth Amendment.
Also, if
For
you're
a
doing a
grand
jury,
jury of your peers.
yeah, what's the point of a jury that way? If there's just a set of standards they have to follow, if they don't follow it, then they're wrong. If the point of the jury, I think, is to add some human subjectivity into it, because if there's no human subjectivity, then you can just have a computer look at it, you can have
What did you think I was saying?
that without the check, when there's any degree of leniency, then the jury, like, they can't have.
As long as you have jury involved, then there can be some arbitrariness, which is in violation. That's what you're saying?
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, well, if that's the case then they're constantly in violation, because what I'm saying is, if that is the case, then what's the point of having a jury? You just have a list of check boxes, anyone can look at it, doesn't have to be a jury, it can be a judge, someone else, what's the point of having a jury?
A list of checkboxes would violate the Fifth Amendment.
Which is what he's saying, right?
That's what it's saying.
I'm a little bit confused about
Eliezer,
what you
as
think
far as
I'm
I can
saying.
understand, Eliezer's asking, he's understanding your point to be that the solution would be imposing a set of standards with no arbitrary quality in them, where there's no human choice about whether or not to apply the standards or whether or not to say that some of the standards are valid, like you just get rid of any sort of arbitrariness of human involvement. That's what he's understanding you to say. But he's saying, what about the fact that if you impose that kind of rule, then by getting rid of all human role in the process, you are getting rid of jury of your peers, which is in the Constitution, and you might as well just give it to a computer. Like that there's no that there could be a problem with that there isn't the ability to impose mercy.
I think
I agree with all that, I didn't finish making the point.
Okay.
Oh, then, so do you want to finish making the point?
No, but I just explained that's why I think
Oh.
that's why I don't think that the death penalty can be fixed in any way, because if there's a jury, there's some arbitrariness, and if there's no jury in checkboxes, that's not okay either. That's what I was trying to say.
So, how do you contend that with, say, like life in prison, if black people are statistically getting life in prison more than white people? Like, can you abolish life in prison as a punishment?
Is that directed to me or like everyone? I don't have an answer for that right now.
But
I'm
for
not
someone,
sure.
for someone that thinks that the death penalty should be abolished, how do you wrestle with the question of like, if this is the first step, what happens, like whatever happens next, can we continue to have a penalty system? If every penalty is applied to the
Well,
system.
what if you make the distinction, like, it's just like, I don't know if it's constitutionally right or anything, but what if you make the distinction between something that is cruel and unusual punishment and something that's not cruel and unusual punishment? Like let's say, let's say for instance you thought that death penalty was cruel and unusual punishment. Well then, it would be abolished, right?
Yeah,
But
but I don't
precedent
think
has
there's
not said
any.
that.
I don't think there's any constitutional basis for saying that's cruel
Yeah,
and
that's
unusual
what I'm
punishment because a capital punishment is constantly talked about in the Constitution.
But capital crimes are designated as being different than, capital punishments are designated as being different than other punishments in the Constitution. The fact that that they say you need a grand jury, isn't that in itself saying that we understand capital punishment to be more severe punishment than, like, being significantly more severe than any other punishment?
Yeah, wait, I have a clarifying question. Are you talking about this in terms of the cruel and unusual punishment, or in terms of like different standards for a discrimination in like a life imprisonment case, for example, versus in a death penalty case?
I think it's the latter.
Wouldn't, in the same way, like, oh, sorry, did you say we're not talking about this in the Eighth Amendment?
In the Fifth.
Okay.
So I think you're conflating two things with your argument. That the Fifth Amendment is about, you're saying because the Fifth Amendment specifies a grand jury for capital cases, then the death penalty is special compared to other penalties.
That was my claim.
But the Fifth Amendment is about the jury to try you, but not about the punishment itself.
But I think it's still
But
makes
that's
a
not a
distinction.
thing, yeah, that's not my understanding of the Fifth Amendment was that, given that it's saying you need a special process to impose this punishment, therefore the punishment must be considered more severe, like there must be a reason why they're saying you need a special process to impose this punishment as opposed to any other punishment.
Where does that conclusion or claim, whatever, where does that lead?
Well, you were asking before, right, that if there's a difference between life imprisonment and the death penalty. That, like, the question is, if you get rid of the death penalty, where does it stop? But,
What do you mean?
There's a distinction. There's a distinction between death penalty and life imprisonment.
This is about application of punishment, not about assigning juries.
Well, application of which punishments? Like, is it, if you say that racism abolished, like that's applicable only for the case of death penalty. But if there's like some examples like racism you can't really control it for other cases, then would it be you abolish death penalty and keep it for other cases because the death penalty is special? Or do you say, oh, we can't do that because every single case is a punishment?
Isn't it, the death penalty is special in another, like, sense, not in its output, not in when it's applied, in how it's applied, like, in who is required to apply it.
But couldn't you also make the distinction saying if there has to be some special way, I think in my sense, if there's some special way to administer it, it is a different crime, it is a different punishment in of itself. If it has to be more specially looked at to make some, for instance.
All right, I'm going to pause.